At 3:17 a.m. on August 18th, Russia's largest tank factory was going dark. A 480 kilovolt substation was burning. Sections of the complex had lost power. Emergency crews were already moving. And more than $300 million in critical production machinery was now at risk. But before Ukraine went after the factory, it first made Russia believe the attack was already over. Minutes earlier, Russian crews thought they had won. Missiles had gone out. Targets had disappeared. Reload crews were already moving. That victory was the trap, because the drones Russia had just destroyed were never meant to hit the factory. While its defenses were recovering, the real strike was already coming in low, heading for the machines the entire production line depended on. 7 minutes earlier, Nizhny Tagil was still quiet. The tank factory was fully powered, its production halls lit against the August night. At 3:10 a.m., a single return appeared on the Russian 96L6E radar, covering the industrial zone. Then 4 more. Within seconds, there were 11. Before the first minute was over, 24 tracks were moving toward the factory. They were not scattered. Their headings held steady, their spacing tight enough to look deliberate. Inside the command vehicle, operators began assigning targets. The S-350 battery shifted toward the approaching formation, while 3 Pantsir S-1s around the complex turned onto the lower contacts. The range kept falling. Every second they waited brought 24 unknown aircraft closer to one of Russia's most important tank production sites. The order came down. Engage. An S-350 interceptor tore away from its launcher. Another followed seconds later. Below them, Pantsir cannons opened fire, throwing streams of 30mm tracers across the dark approaches. The response worked. One contact broke apart. Another vanished behind it. Then several tracks disappeared almost together, but one refused to stay gone. It faded from one sweep, returned on the next, then disappeared again. Debris? A damaged drone? Or something still flying? The fire control crew had only seconds to decide. Another interceptor went up. The contact vanished. On the main screen, the incoming tracks were disappearing. On the weapons panel, ready missiles were disappearing with them. Behind the defenses, production was still running. Not a single strike had reached the factory. From inside the bunker, the defense looked like it was working. And that was exactly why the Russian commander was about to make the decision Ukraine needed. At 3:12 a.m., the reload vehicles started moving. 2 support vehicles rolled toward the S-350 launchers as Pantsir crews checked what remained in their 30mm belts. Radar operators widened the search while the last unstable contacts faded from the screen. The Russians were beginning to reset the defense. On the radar, the picture looked better by the second. The factory was still producing. No weapon had reached the complex. Most of the 24 incoming contacts were gone. That was exactly what the first wave had been built to achieve. Those lightweight drones had never needed to reach Nizhny Tagil. They only needed to make the S-350 fire, force the Pantsers to spend ammunition, and convince the crews inside the bunker that the dangerous part of the night was ending. Instead, something else was already approaching. Beyond the outer defense ring, 14 Ukrainian FP-1 strike drones were coming in much lower than the first wave. They did not stay together. 4 turned left. 6 held the center. 4 pushed east. The groups followed tree lines, service roads, and low industrial ground, where clean radar tracks were harder to hold. Then the approach became less tidy. 1 FP-1 had to climb around an obstacle. 2 behind it widened their spacing. For a few seconds, the center group stretched and the timing slipped. The formation corrected. They kept coming. Back at the factory, Russian crews were still loading missiles and searching a wider sky. They had just fought off 24 targets. Russia had survived the first wave. The problem was that the real one was already much closer than its defenses realized. At 3:13 a.m., the wider search finally caught something it had missed. A return flashed low on the southern edge of the 96L6E radar picture. Then it vanished. Seconds later, it came back farther inside. A Pantsir S-1 turned south. One of the Tor M2s shifted with it. The commander stopped waiting for another high wave. Search low, find what slipped through. For a moment, it worked. A second contact appeared, then a third. The Pantsir began building a firing solution. Then the picture started breaking apart. One track jumped sideways between sweeps. Another briefly split in 2. A target box vanished just as the turret began following it. That was the second Ukrainian layer. 8 EW drones had spread across the approaches, carrying compact jammers and chaff dispensers designed to make clean tracks harder to hold. They were not there to hit the factory. They were there to force Russian crews to spend seconds deciding what was real. As the jammers came on, several drones released chaff across the approaches, adding more returns to an already crowded radar picture. Russia hit back. A Pantsir shredded one EW drone with 30mm fire. A Tor M2 destroyed another, 2 down. Then one of Bravo's 6 FP1 strike drones was caught before reaching the industrial perimeter. 13 remained. For several seconds, Russia seemed to be recovering, but the interference did not disappear with those 2 kills. The surviving EW drones were still transmitting, and the chaff already released across the approaches continued to clutter the sector. Tracks dropped, returned late, then had to be rebuilt. The defenders were not blind. They were simply a few seconds behind. And while they rebuilt the picture, 4 FP1s were already turning away from the main formation. They were not heading for the press hall. They were heading for the 480 kilovolt power node feeding it. At 3:15 a.m., the 4 FP1s that had broken west, Strike Group Alpha, were less than a minute from the 480 kilovolt substation. Then, Russia found them. A Pantsir S-1 snapped onto the lead drone and opened fire. The FP1 disappeared in a burst of 30mm rounds. 3 left. That loss mattered now. Alpha had 1 job, and a quarter of the force assigned to it was already gone. Behind them, Strike Group Bravo, which had lost 1 FP1 on the approach, was down to 5 and kept closing on the production halls. 4 more and Charlie were moving toward the eastern support area. Russia finally understood that it was facing several targets at once. The commander had seconds to decide where the remaining short-range firepower mattered most. The substation came first. 1 Tor M2 and a Pantsir shifted toward the power infrastructure, leaving fewer weapons watching the center and eastern approaches. The Tor found another Alpha drone. Launch. A flash appeared above the industrial edge. 2 left. For Russia, 1 more clean engagement might have been enough. The Pantsir picked up the lower FP1 and committed to it. Cannon fire climbed across the approach. That drone went down, but while the turret followed it, the last FP1 kept closing. By the time the crew shifted back, there was almost no distance left. Impact. A white flash tore across the substation yard. Transformer oil ignited, electrical arcs snapped through the equipment, and sections of the factory dropped into darkness. Production stopped in part of the complex. Then, emergency lighting came on. Russia moved immediately, like electrical crews rushed to isolate the damaged section. Backup power began taking load. Fire crews turned toward the burning transformer. The factory was still standing. The damage still looked containable. But the strike had changed the fight. Russian defenses had been pulled west. Emergency crews were committed. Part of the complex was now running on emergency power. And while Russia fought to keep the electrical system alive, Bravo was already closing on the press hall. Charlie was entering the support zone from the east. The transformer was burning, but the machines worth far more than the substation had not been touched yet. At 3:16 a.m., the factory was already trying to recover. A backup generator came online. Emergency power returned to part of the complex, and for a few seconds, the response appeared to be working. Then Strike Group Bravo arrived. 5 FP1s were still heading for the press hall. A Tor M2 caught the first. Flash, 4 left. The remaining drones kept coming. The Pantsir shifted back toward the center of the complex and opened up with its 30mm guns just before the FP1s reached the buildings. Another drone broke apart. 3 remained. Now the distance was collapsing. 1 FP1 crossed the roofline and disappeared into the press hall. The flash came from inside. A section of the roof kicked upward, then smoke pushed through the opening as the second drone came in behind it. The next impact followed seconds later. Hydraulic lines ruptured. Fluid sprayed across damaged machinery and caught fire, sending flame along the bay while smoke thickened under the roof. But Russia could not concentrate everything there. From the east, Charlie's 4 FP1s were already entering the support and storage side of the complex. The commander had to split the defense again. A short-range engagement destroyed 1 Charlie drone. 3 continued, 1 reached the support area. The explosion pushed smoke across an internal access road just as fire crews were being redirected from the substation. Now the problems began feeding each other. Electrical teams tried to isolate damaged sections. Fire crews split between the transformer and press hall. Backup generators took more load. Then 1 generator tripped. Pressure in part of the suppression system became unreliable. A fire crew made it toward the press hall entrance, then had to back out as heat and smoke rolled through the bay. By 3:19 a.m., the 3 remaining strike drones had cleared the factory perimeter and were turning away from the complex. The air attack was ending. But the factory now had unstable power, fires in multiple sections, damaged press machinery, and emergency crews divided across the complex. The attack was almost over. The factory's most expensive problem had not yet been discovered. By the time the radar picture finally came back together, there were no strike drones left inside the engagement zone. As the August sky brightened over Nizhny Tagil, smoke still hung above the press hall. Fire engines stood between darkened sections of the complex, while crews worked through the damage left behind. From outside, the factory had survived. Much of the press hall was still standing, and inside it, the two massive hydraulic presses were still there. For a moment, that looked like good news. Then the engineers began measuring. The first problem was not what had burned, it was what had moved. The foundations supporting the press machinery had shifted by several centimeters. The readings were taken again. They were still wrong. These were not ordinary machines. Each press was rated between 23,000 and 26,000 tons, and precision depended on alignment that could not simply be ignored or reset with the push of a button. The first press was declared non-operational. Then the second measurement came back wrong as well. Both were out. That was the real payoff of the strike. Ukraine had not needed to flatten the entire factory. It had only needed to remove a few systems the rest of production depended on. Steel could still arrive. Engines and optics could still arrive. Workers could still report for shift. But without those presses, unfinished holes could no longer move through the line at the same rate. Production slowed upstream, assembly waited downstream, and the backlog began to grow. Russia still had the buildings. It still had the workers. It still had unfinished armored hulls. What it no longer had was the same ability to turn them into finished fighting vehicles. The factory survived the night. The production line did not come through unchanged. Thanks for watching. What matters more in modern drone warfare, destroying weapons or shutting down the factories that make them? Let me know below and subscribe for the next breakdown.